All right, what's everybody? Welcome. What's up, everybody? Welcome to today's interview. I have with me Jeem from Geopolitics. Jeem's been doing a lot of good work lately, focusing on refuting things like Islam, refuting things like paganism, as well as the Judaism, the Judaic ideology that developed over time. So we're going to be talking about all those things today. And it might be best to just introduce everybody over here, Jeem, if you would, to your channel and what you cover, and then we'll get into it.
Sounds good. Thanks for having me on here, Jay. So I'm Jeem. My channel is at Geopolitics, and I focus on refuting misconceptions in regards to some of our opponents' attack of Christianity, the Bible, etc., church history. And then I'll also go on the offensive and kind of refute some of their ideas based on their own early history. So a lot of the focus that I have when talking about Islam or Rabbinic Judaism is how they had changed over time. Because it's a common polemic for them to say to us, like, oh, you Christians invented stuff over the centuries, but they did many more inventions. So that's one of the things I like to point out.
Yeah, and you recently had a debate with a pagan slash atheist as well. So we'll get into all that. Let's start with Judaism first, because of course the idea, at least in most people's mind, is that, oh well, this is the oldest, this is the one that's like the mother from which the other branches spring forth in the so-called Abrahamic monotheistic faith. Of course, in our view, there is no Abrahamic faith other than what we profess in our religion as Orthodox. There is no generic monotheism, which all the religions share. This is kind of a presupposition of what's called classical theism, or the Vatican II documents in terms of their natural theology and what they promote. So let's talk about Judaism first. You recently did a video that I thought was really good. It's about a 23-minute video breaking down the difference between Christianity and Orthodox Judaism, and kind of going back into the past and where we eventually parted ways, and how actually Orthodoxy is really the real inheritor of that Hebraic tradition. Do you want to get into that first?
Yeah, so there's a lot of misconceptions with Rabbinic Judaism. You know, there were originally a lot of Judaisms at the time of Christ in the New Testament, first of all. So you didn't just have the Pharisees. And the Pharisees were not these guys who were extreme Torah purists. They were people who innovated. They invented. That's covered in Mark chapter 7 and Matthew chapter 23, where our Lord Christ attacks them for innovating and inventing.
And I might add real quick, I'm not going to interrupt you, that Muslims always bring up is the text in Jeremiah, where Jeremiah talks about the scribes at that time beginning to corrupt the interpretation of the text. It doesn't say that they corrupted the Torah or the prophets. In fact, Jeremiah presupposes that the texts are authentic. It's talking about their traditions that they're developing. It's not talking about the text itself.
Yeah, that's exactly right. They're inventing things along the way. And so many people, including the Rabbinic Jews themselves, have a weird idea of what the Old Testament is and what it isn't. So they think the Old Testament is the story where the Israelites do no bad things and they're the chosen people of God. But in reality, if you read it, starting from Judges and onward, essentially once the conquest of Canaan is established, the Israelites fail over and over and over again. God will send a judgment against them because they fail his commandments. So of course, in the time of Jeremiah, there's going to be people who stray from the original religion and they start inventing things. And so that continues all the way through the age of the Pharisees into the New Testament. Now, a lot of people think, okay, the New Testament is where everything splits up, where Rabbinic Judaism comes from. That's a little better than saying it's the oldest religion, which a lot of boomers and people have been taught that kind of idea. But that's also not correct. The real rabbinic thought comes into play like 400 years after the New Testament. The first couple hundred years, you had all different kinds of ideas. There were some people in Judaism who thought God was like a finite, concrete entity who had a humanoid form. There were these people called the Merkabah mystics who thought God had a literal chair that he sits on, and they were trying to measure how large is the chair, where is it in the throne, kind of like how Salafi Muslims do today. But these are, of course...
Yeah, I was going to say there's a direct parallel with Salafi, yeah.
Yeah, definitely. And I was pointing out in the debate I had with that Thor pagan guy that that's completely contrary to what Maimonides teaches when he talks about divine simplicity and other things. I mean, Maimonides sounds more like a Thomistic Catholic than he does an ancient Jew.
Yeah, let's go back to the period of the Torah. I think you've covered this well. I've covered it. This aspect of God's manifestations, theophanies. We've got modern Jewish scholars admitting now in a lot of their texts. I brought these up, for example, in the opening statement in my debate with Daniel Hakikachu. You've got all these Jewish scholars who are admitting, hey, it's not this abstract Unitarian God that has no immanence or manifestations in the Old Testament. Rather, we find throughout the book of Genesis, for example, many theophanies, many manifestations over and over and over. So God has an ability to appear in some kind of form in time and space, or what we in Orthodox Church call a theophany. They're also admitting that this fluidity is what Summers calls it. This fluidity on the part of God also points to multiplicity in some sense, meaning that he's not a strict Unitarian deity, but that there is Yahweh, there's the angel of the Lord, or the messenger of the covenant that he sends, his face, his glory, one like a son of man, the rider on the chariot. And then we also have the Spirit, his Spirit, which pops up again over and over and over when we're really familiar with the law, the prophets, and the writings. So let's talk about some of that first, because this is really important to what you mentioned in your video, that there wasn't this really strict Unitarianism until that began to develop up into the time of Maimonides.
Yeah, that's definitely true. I like to point out that a lot of the ways that both Judaism and Islam talk about monotheism doesn't really seem to come from the Bible. So when they're critiquing Christians, they'll say, "Oh, that's not real monotheism. How could God enter creation? How can he manifest? How can he do all that?" Well, you look for a citation for what they're saying in the Bible, you're not going to find it. You're not going to see God doesn't ever manifest. That's not part of the Old Testament. So they're getting it from extrapolations of philosophy, where they go, "Oh, well, these philosophers a couple hundred years after Christianity say God has to be, other than anything in creation. So it's below his majesty, as the Muslims would say, to come into creation." And the Jews also believed in something very similar to that, where they say any appearance of God is him just sending someone who carries his name, but It's not God by essence.
Yeah, there's debates. For example, you can go to the Jewish Encyclopedia, the entry on the Shekinah, and you'll notice that there's long histories of rabbinical debates as to whether this is an angel, Metatron, a created image, basically a type of a hologram. This is what St. Augustine speculates for a bit. Or is it the essence of God? And, of course, seems absurd. I think everybody would agree that there's no way in which the essence of God manifests in time and space. But if God is reduced in every predicate to essence, this would become a problem. And this is where you get this, strict Unitarian conception of God, basically isomorphically identifying everything with the essence. This really causes problems for the possibility of the incarnation. And Christianity is an incarnation-based religion. That's why we think it's in continuity with what's actually in the Hebrew texts, which is all of these theophanies. Over and over and over, we see the angel of the Lord wrestling with Jacob. We see him walking in the cool of the garden with Adam and Eve. We see him appearing in the fiery furnace with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. We see him riding the chariot in Ezekiel 1-10, who is like a son of man, who is the face and the form of the glory of God. How does the glory of God have a face and a form? So like Jeem pointed out, it always has to be kind of reinterpreted into weird angel mysticism, and it's Metatron and all this kind of stuff. Or some of the Kabbalists will say it's the rabbi who becomes a magician and sort of turns himself into some sort of deified rabbinical super Marvel superhero or something. But yeah, anything else you want to? What about now in your video? You mentioned the elements that we possess in Orthodoxy, like altar, sacrifice. This seems to be missing in a lot of modern Judaism. Would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, one last note I'll have on the previous subject is, if you press these guys in rabbinic Judaism hard enough, you got to ask them, okay, how would we ever be sure by reading the text what is God and what is not God? Because if every instance where it says God did this, God did that, it's actually a created hologram, or it's, like you said, some divinized rabbi, almost like a Ismaili imam or something, or Shia imam, I mean, how do we know when God's actually there? You can't prove it, because you could just say anytime it says the Lord Jehovah appeared, it could just be some guy representing him. It might not really be him. But
And by the way, wouldn't this again? And I do want to. I think you made a great point in that video where you said you can see a lot of overlap between rabbinic Judaism and Islam. And I say that because in Islam we get the royal we, when in the Quran God is speaking, but speaking through these angelic ministers. This makes perfect sense with the idea of an abstracted Unitarian God who has to communicate through angels and not through a direct presence, and that's essentially what we have with Muhammad and Gabriel supposedly talking to him.
Yeah, that's definitely true. That's 100% true. But in rabbinic Judaism, for the other question you asked me about, like their liturgical process, they don't really possess any of the things that point to this Old Testament priesthood. So it almost looks like Judaism, or rabbinic Judaism at least, is some kind of a quasi-restorationist movement, because they're admitting there's been a break from the tradition after the destruction of Jerusalem and the previous captivities. So they cannot do the priesthood. So they're just temporarily in this limbo state where they're not able to do the religion of the Old Testament. They're not actually able to fulfill anything that comes from that. And that goes to their weird understanding of how the covenants work and what their place is now in history, because they have different ages of history. But yeah, they don't really possess any kind of semblance to what we see. Like Muslims do this too.
Before we get to Muslims, this reminds me of an interview I watched recently with a Orthodox Jew and a guy who was kind of an evangelical Christian Jewish guy who had converted, Messianic Jew, and they were having this debate over this topic. And the evangelical guy said, well, where is the temple, the sacrifice, the animals, all the things that we know are necessary? How are we going to be reconciled with God? How are we going to have atonement if we're missing all those things? And the rabbinical guy basically says, well, the synagogue makes up for that, and the good works that we do in the synagogue, the repentance, the mitzvah, whatever, all those things that the good works that we do, they make up for that, and they count as atonement. In other words, I'm not saying that we don't have sacrifice. The point is that so the temple and its ministry weren't ultimately absolutely necessary, is the admission here. Now, if they're not absolutely necessary, then isn't that kind of the point that we had the prophecy in Genesis 49 that when Shiloh comes, there will no longer be a scepter of David. The kingdom would come to an end. And the nations would look to Shiloh. That's in Genesis 49. That's one of the messianic prophecies. And lo and behold, when Christ comes within his lifetime after his death, burial, resurrection, you have the end of that period. You have the diaspora, and then there's no more temple and its ministries. And that's the very thing that Jesus predicted in Luke 21 and Matthew 24, again, signifying that there would not be the old administration anymore. It would be opened up. But even the Jews in the rabbinic approach still admit that basically the same principle that Christians have about God didn't absolutely need those things.
Yeah, that's really interesting. They make those admissions, and it makes you wonder, what's the problem with them accepting the New Testament and the New Covenant? Because if you look in Jeremiah 31, God says he's going to pass over to the Gentiles. So if that's canon, which it is for them, it's canonical text, what's the problem with when that actually occurs? The Gentiles have a new covenant. What's the issue with that? Your book is saying that is what's going to pass. But on the flip side, the rabbinic Jews will also at the same time somehow say, actually, we're still in the Sinai covenant. So everything changed. We don't have the temple, but we're still in the Sinai covenant. It doesn't track. It doesn't really make any sense how you could fulfill that covenant while not having the temple or at least the tabernacle. Because that covenant, you get your reward, your salvation by perfectly doing the law of Moses. Well, you can't do most of the law of Moses. So what's going on?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, as their perspective, a lot of the texts then have to be kind of recast as interpreted to where the Messiah will come and sort of set up this earthly kingdom. Jews will have the ability to basically run the world. That's their vision of the Messiah, is this very sort of geopolitical, earthly, temporal power. It's not primarily conceived of as a Messiah who is ruling from heaven, from the right hand of the power as our texts talk about. Yeah, we have all these passages. Until I make your enemies your footstool, clearly seems to be a messianic passage. But you'll notice in a lot of the exegesis that you see, like rabbinical Jews do, is that no, that's only talking about David. So in other words, it's like when it's a messianic passage that they admit, anything that might point to Christianity or to Christ, no, that's only about David. So it's a very like back and forth, inconsistent hermeneutic.
Their scholars kind of have a blunder on this, because modern rabbinic Jews say Isaiah 53, very famous chapter, it's not messianic, it's about the whole
right,
of Israel.
The collective people, yeah.
But then Rashi, one of their greatest commentators, says actually it is about Messiah. So that's a big problem. That's a big blunder.
Yeah, some of the texts that we covered in the Kikuchu debate, I think it's his name is Schaefer. He has a little book about Daniel 7 and Daniel 9, and he's talking about the predictions of the Messiah. And he's got a lot of rabbinical and ancient commentators on that passage. And ironically, many of the ancient texts of Judaic tradition think that those are messianic passages. And so they think the Messiah might actually be this sort of divine figure, and that he would in some way be deified. And so these are problem passages, again, that kind of like get reinterpreted or recast. It's always, the only people or manifestations, the only personage speaking is an angel or Metatron, or sometimes they'll say it's Enoch coming back or something like that. But the problem is that at the same time, a lot of these passages are also said to be, as you said, messianic.
Yeah, definitely. And that's with the angelic thing, that's a good place to kind of segue into the Islamic side, because as you mentioned, the angel Gabriel that Muhammad claims to speak to.
Well, hold on. One more thing before we go to Islam.
Yeah, go ahead.
Is could you speak to any more of the similarities or things that you see Orthodox Christianity kind of inheriting from the Hebrew tradition that's missing? Anything else that comes to mind? Because you mentioned quite a bit in your video.
Oh, yeah. No, there's quite a lot. So we kind of vaguely covered the liturgical aspect. You can just look at the actual liturgy of the Orthodox Church, how in Orthodoxy we believe we're the continuation of the Old Testament, not that there's, this one group that's going on. It ceases, there's like a period of nothing, and then a random other group shows up. We don't believe that there's this kind of break in tradition. We're inheriting everything from Moses, David, and through Jesus Christ. And then we already covered kind of the manifestations of God in creation. Again, that's from the Hebrew text. Some great proof text for that would be in Genesis 16, where this angel shows up to Hagar and she calls him. And the text says, she spoke to the Jehovah next to her and said, "You are the Elohim who sees me." So like, if this is not blatantly looking at the text and seeing exactly what it says, I don't know what the other interpretation should be.
Yeah, I love the text in Judges where it says Gideon was talking to the angel like you're talking about. In the text, it actually says Yahweh turned his face to Gideon. So
Yeah.
we can't say this is, Gabriel or something like that.
Well, they'll basically say, anytime that word shows up, the divine name, tetragrammaton, that could just be somebody using his name. So there's really no way to tell when is it actually God, when is it really a representation. In their view, you can kind of never know when God is actually.
But in a lot of these passages, worship is given. And so we know we're not supposed to bow down and worship angels. Although you could argue that sometimes Rabbinic Judaism does, if it gets into the more of the Kabbalistic side, when you get like ideas of angel magic and stuff like that. I mean, in those schools, they might even actually think that you're sort of invoking and having some sort of mystical power through the angels. There's a lot of angel magic going on in some of those schools. I don't know if you know about that.
Yeah, it's definitely weird. I'm glad you mentioned the thing with Gideon and Judges. I think it's Judges 13. It's mirrored in Luke 24, where Christ is on the road to Emmaus. He goes to have a meal with these guys, and once they recognize who he is, he disappears, kind of like how when Gideon recognizes who he's talking to, the angel of the Lord ascends. So it's a very similar story. That parallel is extremely obvious. So
that's a great point. Also, Shamoun pointed out, was a good argument, is that when the same being appears to Samson's parents and says, "Why do you ask my name, seeing as it is wonderful?" That's the same wonderful counselor, mighty God. So it's identifying the same personage as the same predicted divine Messiah in Isaiah 11.
Exactly. And then I guess for the rest of the similarities, I just think that uh, Christianity as a whole, if you want to call it a generic collection of religions, but especially Orthodoxy, has the best interpretation of what is occurring in the Old Testament without having to appeal to like gaps of knowledge and going, oh, it could be an angel, could be a representation, we have no idea. And we mentioned the liturgy, of course, and then we mentioned how, or I mentioned at least in some other videos, how the new covenant is the perfect fulfillment of everything in the old, because it's not this idea where we're rejecting the Old Testament, but rather what we're doing is saying, hey, there were things that the prophets did prior to Moses's covenant that we're now going to be returned to. Like when Christ does the abrogation of divorce, he's just going to the pre-Mosaic Testament. He's not saying, oh yeah, the Old Testament's gone. There's a lot of people make that mistake. They think the Sinai covenant of Moses is the whole Old Testament, but there's many prophets before Moses, and they didn't do that law.
Yeah, all the covenants, as Paul says, are yea in him, in Christ, meaning that they all find their telos and their fulfillment in him. And I think that, in the Orthodox perspective, it makes perfect sense to say that elements of the earthly covenant of Sinai have been fulfilled, but the covenant is still, quote, in effect via Jesus basically bringing the telos of that covenant. So it's not really correct to say that like everything was, quote, canceled out or done away, because Jews might say, well, but the covenant of Moses is said to be eternal. Yeah, correct. The way that it's eternal is in the person of Christ, who is the fulfillment of not just the Aaronic priesthood, but also the Melchizedekian priesthood, which is superior to the Aaronic priesthood, a la Hebrews 7. That's the argumentation that's used there, that because Abraham tithed to Melchizedek, he was showing deference to the more ancient and more Christological, we could say, priesthood of Melchizedek. Hence Psalm 110 identifying the Messiah's priesthood as after the order of Melchizedek. So anyway, I don't mean to ramble and take up all the time, but prophet, priest, and king can only be fulfilled in one person, and that's why it has to be son of David, who's also of a different type of priesthood. Because a Jew might say, well, but how could he be a priest if he's not Aaronic? He's a Melchizedekian priest, exactly.
Exactly. Yeah, just to kind of cap off that whole topic, what you said actually kind of leads into this perfectly, is that I think a lot of people, well, people who attack Christianity, especially Orthodoxy, like rabbinic Jews and Muslims, they're ignorant of the book of Genesis. So they think everything just starts with the law of Moses, and if you're not doing the exact Sinai covenant, oh, false religion. But Jeremiah 31 says we will have a new covenant. So there has to be some understanding of that and of Genesis. Like they act like the other prophets didn't exist. And I think for Muslims, what makes them think that, other than the fact that maybe a lot of them just don't read the biblical text, is that for them, everything's kind of in stasis in the Quran. All the prophets speak the same way. They have the same kind of message. It's a constant, it's an eternal message. But in the Bible, it's not this constant eternal message. Things do change. The law does develop, and God gives instructions to people in places and times that may be different to the people before them.
Yeah, this is a great point that's overlooked in a lot of the Islamic argumentation and apologetic that we do against them, which is that in our view, a lot of these things make sense as to why they came to be. The ritual laws, the purity laws, they were symbolic of virtue and vice, good and evil. A lot of the, for example, unclean animals signified the demonic. So there's a significance and a meaning to these rituals, the purification, the baptisms of the book of Leviticus, typifying and presaging Christian baptism, Passover presaging the Eucharist, etc. But in Islam, as we move into that now, a lot of these sort of arbitrary purity laws and dietary laws that carry over, they don't have any significance or purpose. Even the term Messiah in Islam has really no meaning. What does that even mean? And it specifically in the Hebrew context makes sense as the anointed one, the Mashiach, the Messiah who would come to fulfill these prophecies. It doesn't have any significance in Islam, because Islam does clearly appear to be a very low tier copy and paste job of the previous revelations.
Yeah, what's interesting there, definitely, there's been so much Islamic debate over the meaning of the words, like the etymology of Masih in Arabic. What does it mean? They won't say anointed, or if they do, they're just appealing to the biblical text, but their own text doesn't mention it. Now, you'll have vague mentionings in the Quran about the animal sacrifices, but we don't know why they were done. And a lot of Muslims are ignorant of that, and they think it's a pagan thing that was in the Old Testament, but it is mentioned in the Quran in one verse. And there's a lot of interesting parts about their law system that I've pointed out that don't really seem to make sense. So like there's a very famous hadith where it says Isa, their version of Jesus, will come on Judgment Day and he will destroy all the swine. And there's a big, fear of swine in both the Jewish and Islamic worlds. But if you look at the Old Testament, Leviticus actually says shellfish is an abomination, but swine is just unclean. So shellfish is worse. But for some reason, the pig is getting all the attention. It's like a cultural thing. It doesn't really continue with what Moses actually taught.
Well, and at the same time, I mean, did Satan create the pigs? I mean, didn't God also create? It's like in the debate that I had with Azrar Rashid, and he was saying that God cannot come through vagina dirty, pee come from vagina. And it's like, okay, so who created the vagina? You know what I mean? It's like
who made the pig, exactly.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that's really interesting because they basically will admit that like not just the meat of a pig, but like being around a pig is like radiating this unholy.
It's radiating demonic bacon energy. Okay, so let's get to that now. So we're on to Islam. I made the argument that I think one of the key defeaters, kill shot against Islam is that it's not in continuity with what came before in the Torah or even in the Evangel, which is not a book. It's the message of Christ. So let's get into Islam. You had a video a while back that got a lot of views. It was really popular. What are the basic arguments and proof texts that you went to in that video to help us understand what the main problems with Islam are?
Yeah, I've done quite a few videos on Islam. The one that was most popular was a collab between myself and Kyle, and in that one we talked about the similarities between Islam and some strange borrowings from like the Talmud and other spiritualities that really have nothing to do with the continuity of the Bible. And so a lot of Islamic theology seems to think that whatever the Jews are doing, that's just been the Old Testament. So they won't say, yeah, the Talmud is they won't say it's a holy book. But there are influences from it that seem to be as if this book has any continuity with Moses when it doesn't. So you'll see things that are interesting. There's a couple quotes that are found in similarity in Islamic texts and Talmudic texts, such as if you slay one man, it says if you slay the entire world. If you rescue one man, it says if you rescue the entire world. I don't see a citation for that in the Torah or anywhere else in the Old Testament. It actually comes from the Talmud. And there's also some similarities, like we mentioned, about the kind of mode in which God operates. I would argue that the way in which Muhammad speaks to God, which is through the angel, is the way that the rabbinic Jews think you speak to God, but then there's no confirmation.
That's a great point.
Yeah, there's no confirmation to know, did you really speak to God, or did some being, an entity appeared and said, I am here, I'm a messenger from God? Where's the evidence that God can ever give us proper revelation? How do we know we're talking to God if it's just entities and jinns and spirit beings saying, oh, I represent God? Well, where's the proof? Like, we don't know.
Yeah, like Deuteronomy 13 and Deuteronomy 18 says, in prior given Torah revelation, whatever comes that's new has to be in continuity with what came before. You can't have something that pops up new that's totally out of continuity. And by continuity, I don't mean that there won't be a new covenant or something like that. That's still consistent because the existing revelation says there will be a new covenant. I will raise up a prophet from amongst you. So the existing Torah revelation says the Gentiles will eventually believe in the God of Israel. The Messiah will be a key part of that. There's going to be a new prophet to come. And then we get, text in Deuteronomy saying that here's a key test for a true prophet versus a false prophet. Any new revelations that are claimed have to be consistent with what came before. And at a very fundamental level, if you know the Torah, if you know the Old Testament very well, it's not very hard to see that Islam is not in continuity with it. It makes no sense. They don't, as Jeem pointed out, in my experience, like they don't even understand why there was a temple. This is a gigantic portion of the Torah. You got Leviticus, you've got Numbers, you've got all kinds of laws and rules that pertain to the temple, which in Islam basically doesn't make any sense. They don't really know why it was there. It's just sort of a generic thing that's passed over in the Quran where it says something like, and Solomon built many temples. And it's like, yeah, but why? And I was
just going to say, it's compared to kind of how the Kaaba is in Mecca in Saudi Arabia. It's kind of just the house of God, but it's just a generic place where God, well, they can't really say where God dwells because they don't believe in that. So I guess it's just the house in tribute to God. But we don't know, what are you doing with it? Where are the sacrifices and why? Like you said, why are we sacrificing? What's the point of that?
Yeah, Gabriel Said Reynolds' book is really good for discussing stories in the Quran from the Bible that are all jumbled up. And the stories don't make any sense because you can tell they were like cribbed and maybe heard orally, and then the details got mixed up, and they didn't understand the purpose of the terminology in the Torah and in the Gospels. And so when they heard these things, they would kind of crib, and there would be like, there's a section of the Gospel of John, for example, that's in the Quran that's kind of random. And so it's just kind of cobbled together. What do you have any other examples or thoughts on like inconsistencies with the Quranic narrative and the revelation that came before? And how would you rebut a Muslim that said, well, but the Bible's corrupted? That's why it's like that.
Yeah, well, I would say that the Quran impresses upon the reader, from what I've seen at least, that you do already have some kind of a knowledge, because it doesn't give us Moses' whole life story. It just says, and Moses the prophet did this and that. And if I've never heard of Moses before, it's like, who is this guy? Like, why do I care about Moses? What's his story? Or Jesus, who is that? I have no idea. All I'm seeing are references to people that the Quran at least assumes you already know. You already know Moses, here's his real story. Oh, you heard about the Christian Jesus, here's our version. And so that's what's kind of interesting. There is no chronological storytelling. First of all, the whole Quran is written kind of like we would say like the Psalms, so it's just poetic revelation. And it's told a little bit out of order. So there is no, here's where Jesus comes from and stuff. It's just, oh, and by the way, the Messiah of the Christians, they have it wrong. Here's the correct.
And doesn't it sort of give us the injunction to go and check with prior revelation?
Yeah, it does say to go and check with prior revelation, and that the prophet had been spoken of in previous scriptures, or at least alluded to. So they won't say, yeah, we need to find his full name in Arabic in the Bible, but any kind of semblance of, oh, there's a prophet coming, that would have to be Muhammad then. That's how they're interpreted.
Well, but what I'm saying is, like, when it comes to the message of the Quran overall, it's saying, you know, if this is what I said in the Daniel Hakikachu debate, like if I'm a 7th century Christian or Jew, and I'm hearing this message of the Quran, and it's telling me, hey, go and check the message of the Quran with prior revelation, and you will see that we're in continuity with the prophets. How could I do that when I go and check the revelation? It's not in continuity, and then the response is, oh, well, that's where it's corrupted. So, I mean, this is just a ridiculous circular moving the goalpost argument.
Yeah, I remember that part of that debate. I did a review on it as well, and I pointed out that was a really good point you made, because if we go and check, like you said, it's not the same thing. So the excuse is, oh, it's been corrupted. So if it's been corrupted, how can I check to know that this is the true religion? Well, you need to check the ancient text. But you're saying in the 7th century that this wasn't corrupted, but we know it's the same as in the 7th century. So
and the texts that are ancient are the Christian and Jewish texts. like what do you mean check the ancient text? The ancient what? Muslim text? That doesn't exist. So the only texts we could go to are the existing Christian and Jewish manuscripts.
Well, that's where the fantasia of al-Tawrat, al-Injil comes from, because it's this idea that, well, if the written one doesn't necessarily add up, there might be some similarities, but if it doesn't add up, there has to have been given to Jesus and Moses, literally, like the rabbinics will say that the Torah is, some of the ultra-Orthodox Jews will believe that the Torah, like the Quran, is like this uncaused eternal book that fell out of heaven and was given to Moses. So the Muslims won't say that about the Torah, al-Tawrat, but they'll say that Jesus received a book called the Injil. So it's not like a message he's preaching orally. It's actually a scroll or a book. And so they'll say, where's the Aramaic Bible? Where's the Aramaic Gospel? How come you guys have the Greek? Which is extremely shallow arguing, especially because we know that Hebrew is not a dead language. So there's Hebrew and Aramaic mentioned in the New Testament. Paul speaks Hebrew, and when Jesus speaks to Paul, he speaks in Hebrew on the road to Damascus. So it's not like there's no Hebrew. But anyway, that's where this idea that if it doesn't match the actual text we have, maybe there was a eternal or divine book given to Jesus and to Moses, and we don't have access to those, which again brings us into the circle. How do we check then? How am I supposed to know if this is the true one if I can't access
Yeah,
Moses
exactly.
before?
And for those that are in the audience and are not familiar with this, yes, like it's that bad and silly of an idea. They actually thought that when they heard the gospel of Jesus, they thought that was a book or a scroll. So it's not the message that Jesus preached, as in the gospel, the four gospels. They thought that this is Jesus's scroll that was given to him, just something ridiculous. That's not what the gospel is. It is the message that Christ preached, which is the message of salvation through, what we find in the New Testament: go out, be baptized in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Death, burial, resurrection. That is the gospel. It's not a scroll that floated down from heaven to Jesus. So, any other? I know that was kind of a lengthy video that you did that went really viral. What's some other things that you pointed out in that video? Some other key problems in Islam that you think are essential?
I did mention the Talmud thing, and then kind of this idea of, like you said, the circular reasoning. I would just say that I don't think the Quran has a proper grasp, first of all, on the Christian doctrine of the Trinity. So even if we assume, let's play Shaitan's advocate and say, okay, maybe the Trinity is not the true revelation, can we at least know what it is? But the Quran doesn't point out what it is. It says weird things like Allah is not the third of three, and, Jesus and Mary are not gods, which is like the generic. It doesn't say Allah. It says like Ilah, which is kind of the generic version of God. So he's not a divine God, but he's also Allah, meaning the Father or something, is the third of three. It's very vague. Like you would expect if the book was uncaused and it came from heaven, it would pinpoint exactly, oh, Christians, here where you messed up in Constantinople 1, Ecumenical Council. But there's no mention of the Christian doctrines. And the Trinity is a very vague thing, like just don't believe in three. One is better. Occam's razor, man. Why do we need three? I mean, that's kind of the whole argument.
Yeah, I remember, hearing a long time ago that, I don't remember exactly, I think I read it in Pelican many years ago, that Muhammad had been influenced by Nestorian versions or quote Christianity that's Nestorian. And then when I got the Oxford Handbook of Islam, there's an entire essay on there, both Arian and Nestorian influences on Muhammad. So we have to understand that this helps us figure out why they came up with the confusion that they did in the Quran, which is that they have this weird idea that there is, Jesus has a special role. We don't exactly know what that is. He's called in some sense Word. But his mission, the purpose of virgin birth, is not really explained. Why would there need to be a virgin birth? There's no theological redemptive context for why those things are there. They're just said to be there. And that's because the theological influence that Jeem was just talking about was clearly Arian and Nestorian, and that makes perfect sense when you read the Quran from that perspective, because that's exactly the type of theology that they have.
Yeah, and actually that'll lead me into a great point here, which I mentioned when you debated Mr. Jake, the Muslim metaphysician, not long ago. I did a super chat question. I asked him, hey, if because he's hangs out with these neo-Salafi types, if the philosophy of the Greeks is like no good and Christianity was corrupted by it, why in Quran 1:12 does the author of the Quran state that God is the one, the absolute, which is essentially word for word what Plotinus calls God? Is that not just Neoplatonism? And his answer was, well, we don't believe in absolute divine simplicity. Therefore, it's fine if that word is that. I mean, I thought it was really kind of a cop-out answer. What's interesting there is that Arius himself was influenced by Neoplatonism. So you have this Greek philosophy and, right, of course, Christian heresy that influenced a lot of the thought at that time.
Well, and to the point of Dr. Khalil, when he had his debate with Jake, Dr. Khalil is Neoplatonic, and he interprets the Quran in this very Neoplatonic way, with the pen and the scroll, these kind of being references to the first, second, third principle of the manifestations from God. That's all the emanations and the process of emanation from God. So we can see, even with the Shia and Sufi influences, the Neoplatonic element, as well as even the very sort of non-sophisticated, non-philosophical versions that we find in people like Jake. Now, anything else that you want to hit? We're not in a rush. I'm not trying to rush you, but this is really good on Islam. Tell us some more on Islam if you have anything.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, the Neoplatonic thing is really interesting, and a lot of Christians will miss out on that because they're so focused on Trinity versus one versus this versus that. They don't see that, and this is what I like to point out, the monotheism that Jews and Muslims are talking about is the monotheism of extreme philosophy. It's not the monotheism of the Old Testament.
Absolutely. By the way, if you look at that text that I've referenced many times from Aquinas, where when he's defending divine simplicity, I think it's the text De Veritate. It's in the Ralph McHenry selected readings of Aquinas. When he's arguing for divine simplicity against John Damascus's arguments for the essence energy distinction, he cites Maimonides and says that, but Rabbi Moses says, blah, blah, blah. God cannot have accidents, and if he were to have real distinctions between essence and energy, then he would have accidents. Therefore, Maimonides is correct. If you read Dr. Ed Feser, for example, he says this is just what classical theism is. It's the God of Averroes, Avicenna, Aristotle, Plato, Augustine, and Aquinas. Yeah, that's the monotheistic religion that we don't believe in. We do believe in monotheism, but it's the monarchia of the Father, as Dr. Branson eloquently demonstrates. But that is not the same thing as a Unitarian Islam that is totally distinct from Christ and Christianity. And Muslims themselves will tell you that we don't accept you as monotheistic with us. So this idiocy of Christian ecumenists and natural theology proponents who want to act like, well, because we have the same term monotheism that we share, they're monotheists, we're monotheists, therefore we must believe in the same God. That's a quantifier shift fallacy. But also, Muslims themselves will tell you, you don't worship our God.
Yeah, they definitely admit that. And then the interesting thing with the natural theology is, I mean, it's really just kind of unbiblical. A lot of the early fathers say, yeah, philosophy's all right, but even the lowest thing that Moses could ever say is greater than the highest thing that Plato or Aristotle could say. So philosophy can be helpful, but we can't just go, oh, these guys share Aristotelian metaphysics with us, ergo it's the same God. It's a very confusing concept. It's almost like the corpus hermeticum. People are saying like,
Absolutely.
oh yeah, all these gods and prophets, they actually come from this one God who unites everything together. So Plato and all these guys, actually, they're worshiping the same thing. Therefore, their revelation is equal to Moses. And that's
Exactly.
where these issues come from.
Yeah, it leads to, if you're consistent with that approach, it seems to lead to perennialism. And that what you just described is kind of a Neoplatonic version of perennialism. Why wouldn't we think that all of these things are manifestations of the divine if that's the case?
Why not Hinduism, right? Because like there were, quote, Orthodox Hindus who aren't as, I mean, they're still polytheists, but they're not as crazy about the polytheism as some folksy Hindus would be. Why can't those Hindu gods just be part of the natural revelation too? Couldn't that be how God speaks to India? I mean, there's kind of no limits if you're going to adapt that kind
Well,
of...
Nostra Aetate actually kind of speaks that way. It's like, this is how God, generic God, reaches the Hindu, is through the Hindu's desire for release from the attachments of this world. And it says something like, Hindus seek God in refuge. They adore God in refuge. They seek God and adore him in refuge from the ways of the world. So it's whatever the stupid terminology is. But again, adoration is a form of worship. So if they had not chosen the terminology of worship, maybe they could get away with those passages. But that tells me that, so actually God accepts Hindu worship. It's just on a graded scale, in the Vatican II documents, to where like, well, Hindus are down here, Muslims are up here because they're monotheists, supposedly, and then up here is evangelical Christianity, and then you got Anglicanism very close to Rome, and then Orthodoxy is right next to Rome, and then you got Rome. So there's concentric circles and gradations, which makes sense in a Neoplatonic emanation type of perspective.
I want to ask you a question, actually. Well, two things really quick. The Hindu thing with Catholics... video dropped for me for a second.
Yeah, the video dropped. You're back. Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, I was just going to say, the Catholic thing doesn't really make sense to me either, the natural theology stuff, especially with Hinduism, because Hindus have a very extreme form of aestheticism, but Judaism and Islam reject that. So, like, we're just saying, like, aestheticism is not as important as monotheism. Like you said, the concentric circles doesn't really make any sense. But I did want to ask you, you had a discussion with Trent Horn some time ago on the topic of the theophanies, which I found kind of interesting. I know we're a little off topic now, but that just goes to prove this kind of error in accepting and being super ecumenical to other religions, because Trent was saying, yeah, there is no Trinitarianism in the Old Testament. There's no theophanies. I mean, he's essentially stating what some of the popes have said, which is that Judaism is the elder brother. So it's kind of assuming that it's not a different religion, it's just an incomplete Christianity, which is
Exactly. Yeah, which is totally false. If you read the epistle to the Galatians, Paul makes it very clear that the only seed of Abraham that are accepted are Christians. Christianity is the only way to be the seed of Abraham. And why is that? Well, Paul's argument in Galatians and in Romans in chapter 4 and in Hebrews in the discussion of the Sabbath in chapter 4, but all of those texts argue that the gospel was preached to the Jews in various ways and signs and symbols. They don't have a different path or way to be saved other than us. Everyone is
dual covenant.
Yeah, exactly. Everyone is saved via faith in the future coming Messiah or in us looking back to the Messiah that came. That's the only way to be saved. And this is why in Hebrews 11, he can say that we're all part of the same heavenly Jerusalem. All of us, whether you're Samson, Moses, etc., Basil, Paul, St. Simeon the New Theologian, we're all part of that same body. That's the argumentation of Hebrews 11. And that's why it's not a different gospel that was preached. Again, go back and read John 5-9. Jesus argues with the Pharisees over and over and over. I was the one with Abraham. I was the one with Moses on the mountain. Moses was there with me face to face. I am, in other words, I'm the face of Yahweh. That's what Jesus is arguing in John 5-9 with the Pharisees. So this means that they don't have to have the terminology correct of homoousios and eternal generation. They don't have to have that terminology to know there is Yahweh, there is his angel of the covenant, and his spirit. And that's who the Old Testament Hebrew worshipers worshipped. That is the triad. And so Trent was making all these fallacies and equivocations by thinking that, oh, well, they didn't know the word Trinity, so they weren't Trinitarian. Oh, really? You sure you want to make that argument? Because the gospel, yeah, it's a Muslim argument, and the gospel writers didn't know the word Trinity, so they weren't Trinitarian. I mean, that's ridiculous. But yeah, I think you're absolutely right to go back to that because it fits with Islam very well. Because the motivation of those Vatican II texts, Lumen Gentium 16 and Nostra Aetate, both of those texts, which Trent knows he has to defend, put him on the horns of a dilemma. Trent horns of a dilemma. Where he has to basically say, well, the Old Testament is a Unitarian thing, and that's the shared religion that we have with Muslims and Jews. Sorry, it's not.
Yeah, that's totally nonsensical. I do want to mention that thing you mentioned with Dr. Khalil Andani. I spoke to him after your debate with Jake, and he had attacked Jake before and said, what do you think of these verses that are clearly Neoplatonic? Of course, he believes in a Neoplatonized version of Islam, but I find his view interesting because he's an Ismaili Shia, but there's also Sunnis who are part of the Ash'ari philosophical school, and they accept a lot of philosophy. So the point I was going to make is that Jake and all these Neo-Salafi guys are part of a restorationist movement. I mean, they're kind of like the Baptists of the Islamic world. Like they say, everyone before us was kind of lost and corrupt. We're like the third path. We're the only true Muslims. I mean, it's not historical. It pops up in like the mid 1700s, maybe at the earliest. I mean, that's kind of it. It's not historical Islam.
Yeah, it's a great point. For those that don't know, Salafi means the early generations, the early righteous. So the idea is that, like you pointed out, great analogy to Baptists. For the Baptists or Seventh-day Adventists or these kind of people, like they'll often say, oh, we want to go back to the early pure church, right, or the first few centuries. The first few centuries before Constantine turned it into the Catholic Church, right? So that's kind of the vantage point that they're coming from, which is not totally anti-philosophical because Ibn Taymiyyah and these characters, they did use philosophical terminology, but this is another point that people miss, which is that Sunni Islam, I don't think it even realizes that these ideas that they're getting, like basic bitch empiricism, atomism, occasionalism, these are ideas from Greek philosophy. They're not ideas from the Quran. It's like, but they think it's like, this is from the Quran, that proves inspiration. It's like, dude, this is like ancient Greek philosophy. What are you talking about?
Yeah, it's very similar to like the Baptists, evangelicals. A lot of groups are like, I don't need all this church, nonsense, jargon, philosophical, pagan mumbo jumbo. I just want to get back to the word of God. But with the Salafis, it's even worse because they'll takfir, which means, essentially anathematize other Sunni Muslims for doing things that Sunnis have, in fairness, been doing for 1,000 years. So like they had shrines and certain attitudes towards praying, and I wouldn't say liturgy, but ways that they prayed in their masjids that the Salafis are attacking and saying, oh, takfir, that's not the real religion, but they're just restoring something out of thin air. So I don't understand how they have the authority to do that. Like, how did the first Wahhabis or Salafis, earlier with the Salafis, I mean, receive the authority from God? How do you know that you're the one who has this duty to restore? And that's a lot of Protestants have that issue too. There's no unbroken chain. So then how do you know that you're the one that has to restore it? What if you're not correct? Because there's no more revelation given to you. It's a massive problem for people like Jake and these other guys who, we don't need the Greek philosophy, but they're rejecting like 90% of their religion.
Yeah, that's a great point. Now, if you have anything else on Islam, go ahead and do that. I want to shift into a little bit of history that a lot of people don't know about, which you can tell us about in terms of like Uniatism and what's happened in the history of Lebanon and so forth. But I don't want to move too quick if there's anything you wanted to point out about Islam.
No, I think that's a good way to end it on just kind of the neo-Salafis. Just for the audience, like if you're not aware, a lot of Muslims who argue online, especially if they're arguing as diaspora in the West, may or may not be part of this neo-Salafi movement where they're kind of representing not the historical version of Sunni Islam. And even the Sunnis have differences between, like I said, the Asharis are the ones who are very Hellenistic, and then you have many who are not. And then beyond that, there's the jurisprudence disagreements. So like Maliki, Shafi'i, Hanbali, Hanafi, these are differences in how to apply the law. So this idea...
yeah. Go ahead.
I was going to say this idea that there's this one very simple religion that's existed for almost 600 years.
Yeah.
Not there.
Also, this parallels too with a point of weakness, I think, in Judaism, which is that Judaism also is a very decentralized, all over the place school where, for a lot of Jews, for example, there's a question that comes up about dietary laws or rulings or whatever. In their view, you just basically do whatever the local rabbi says. And so that's kind of as far as it goes. But the problem is that, but couldn't there be like a million different opinions on these texts, and don't Jewish commentaries and rabbinical commentaries on the text devolve into infinite debates about minutia and just sort of like, insane, like you pointed out in your video, like, well, what's the right way to wash the pot? Do I wash it with my right hand, or do I tie my shoes with my right hand, with my right foot first? Or it just devolves into this very OCD kind of weirdness, and that I think leads to, ironically, relativism. And Judaism seems to be very relativistic. It has nothing, it's not interested in objective truth or whatever. It's interested in the rulings for the specific localized group, and then pretty much everything else doesn't even matter. So do you see what I'm getting at? Like the structure of the rabbinical system seems to be relativistic, which I would think is problematic.
Yeah, and then one last point. It's interesting how Islam will copy a lot of those attitudes, but then at the same time, they're bound to this idea of their own objective universal morality.
Right.
Like, which one is it? Are we relative or universal?
And like you pointed out, like, so we're sold that, Islam is very simple. There's pillars, Allah is one, and then you've got like all of these schools fighting back and for centuries about, what does it even mean for Allah to unify, to Tawheed?
Oh, one last thing I wanted to mention actually before we move on. The Salafis, again, are really interesting because when you debated Jake, remember, he was talking about anthropomorphism. But most Muslims will say, no.
Right.
Allah's transcendent. He doesn't have a form. But he was saying he has a form, but we don't know what it is. Like, it's a hand, but it's not a hand. It's a very interesting difference that separates them from most of historical Islam.
Well, yeah, one of the texts I have that I read for that debate was a Sunni critique of Ibn Taymiyyah and the Salafi ideology, and they were basically saying these guys are anthropomorphic idolaters. Well, so wait a minute. I thought Islam was a simple anti-idolatry religion. So like you've got giant chunks calling the other giant chunks idolaters, but I thought this was all. It's kind of like the papacy, right? It's like, well, we've got the Pope, so everything's going to be solved, and it's going to be simple, and we're all going to know what's true. But that's not actually how it manifests in history. It's a lot more complex, and yeah. All right, so let's move on then to you brought up in one of the live streams that I did recently some interesting history and you knew about Lebanon and Uniatism and Jesuits, and let's rehearse some of that because it's an area I don't know a lot about. I know some basic history of Uniatism, but not like in specific countries. And we brought up, I think, like CIA operations and that kind of stuff. My immediate memory is not CIA operations, but in fact Victor Ostrovsky mentions in his book another country's operations in Lebanon that had to do with an embassy, bad events happening at an embassy. People can figure out what I'm talking about. We don't want to go too hard on that, but that relates to, in general, Western intelligence being very interested in Lebanon for many reasons, obviously for the Middle East and tense relations there with Israel and so forth. But I think it goes back further with the introduction of Uniatism there. Do you want to get into some of that?
Yeah, so what's interesting, we'll kind of start from the earlier part, is with Lebanon, the country's really created by a sect known as the Maronites. They're Eastern Catholics. They weren't part of any other church that we can know of. Like, they weren't technically Oriental, they weren't Eastern Orthodox, they weren't anything. They were kind of like Monothelites for a little while, and they were persecuted by the Byzantines. Eventually, when the Franks showed up for the Crusades, the Maronites kind of jumped out of their caves and said, actually, we've been Catholic the whole time. So they end up kind of purging them of some things that they saw as heretical, introducing them as kind of one of the earlier Eastern rites into Rome. And so from that point onward, the Western connection was really easy to grasp. So after the Crusades, even France especially, but also the papacy, had a very strong relationship with what happened in Lebanon. And into the time of the Ottomans, Lebanon was always seen as kind of an enclave for the West to have a good amount of influence, again, particularly with France and the papacy. So throughout the Ottoman Empire, whenever the Ottomans would get a little too testy in Europe or a little too mean to some of their minorities, Christians and other groups, France would always step in and say, actually, we're the protectors because you have this little area here that's majority Christian, so you can't say this is all a Muslim area. And that would develop throughout time. There are a lot of tribal wars throughout all of Ottoman history. But the intrigue with the Jesuits is interesting because it starts to play in the late 1700s through to the 1800s, and especially in the early 1900s, where, again, there are a lot of tribal warfare going on. And the Maronites, unlike the Greek Orthodox and even some of the Melkites, did not get that much involved with this warfare. But the Maronites were always very headstrong and trying to create some kind of a state. So eventually, France pressured the Ottomans to create a smaller than, and Lebanon was already very tiny, it's like the size of New Jersey, but even smaller than that, was just a Christian enclave, and it was kind of a semi-autonomous zone. Eventually, the Melkites and the Maronites would align for a lot of militaristic purposes, and the Orthodox would sometimes be either neutral or very softly be on the side of the Druze or the Muslims, simply because they didn't want sectarian warfare to burst out into wider Syria, which it eventually did. But in any event, the Jesuit intrigue comes in the 1800s and so, and eventually that goes into how Lebanon's founded, but I'll take a small break from the rant before we get into how Lebanon was founded.
Yeah, I mean, again, no need to take a break because it's not an area I know very much about. So, go ahead with the Jesuits. For those that don't recall, for the sake of the audience, maybe we should take a little bit of a brief break here. We do have some super chats. I'll remind everybody to support the stream via super chats. Those are done through Streamlabs. The link is pinned right there in the chat. You can also look in the show description. Also, Jeem's channel is linked in the show description. So if you like today's discussion, be sure and get over there and follow him. Turn on the notifications, all those things that you got to do, push all the bells and the whistles and all that. And I want to remind you guys to head on over to chalk.com. That is the show sponsor, choq.com, to get the best in supplementation, including the Tonkat 100 boosting testosterone. Jamie and I are back in the gym and we're loving it. And nothing helps better than having good, solid supplementation that's legit. It's not junk. It's not crap. I know those guys very well. We have a great relationship for the last 3 years. And it's a great company. So be sure and go and support those guys. Use the promo code J44Life, that's JAY44LIFE, to get 44% off those great products. Mind Hacks says for $5, nothing to say, but he says for $5. Well, hey, that's fine. Appreciate the $5. Maya Jean 20 says for $3. Is it possible that theophanies of God manifesting himself into lower and perceivable dimensions for us? For example, we perceive in 3D, but God is outside of time. I don't know if this would be what's called partialism, because I don't think it necessarily applies to dimensions. Well, I just think that God, in terms of being omnipotent, there's nothing that limits him to be able to manifest in time and space. So while God is beyond being, he's super essential. We use all these terms to describe his essence as apophatic. He's not just apophatic, he's also cataphatic, meaning that he can be immanent, he can manifest, he can be in one place in one time, and that's the whole basis for the incarnation. I mean, if you don't believe that, you wouldn't believe that Christ, in terms of the text in Philippians, limited himself, meaning that he chose a mode of being in time and space to become incarnate, taking on the form of a servant. Philippians actually says he limited himself by, in other words, not exercising every power that he had. That means that there's a distinction between essence and energy in God. There has to be. Otherwise, classical theism precludes and negates the incarnation. Mindhack again sends $5 and says, I have nothing to say. Well, thank you, Mindhack, for the super chats. We appreciate the support nonetheless. Getting back to the question of the role of the Jesuits and their intrigues in Lebanon, enlighten us, Jeem. We defer to you.
Yeah, so actually I wanted to read a quote here I have from, you can't even buy this book anymore. It's from this guy called Colonel Charles Churchill. He's a British officer, agent, colonel, obviously, who was stationed in Lebanon in 1840 to 1860. He's writing this book in 1862. I'm going to be light with the language because there's some stuff that might get a little brutal here. He's just commenting on what the Maronites, so those are the Syriac Eastern Catholics, and the Melkites, who are the Greek Eastern Catholics, have to say about fomenting warfare to kind of carve out their own state. He says, to crown all, the Maronite patriarch had openly declared that if the Druze persisted in demanding to be governed by a prince of their own sect, he and his clergy would head the Maronites, march against them, and totally exterminate them. And then quoting the Melkite, he says, the Greek Catholic Bishop of Zahle issued a proclamation calling on all true Christians to come forward without fear. Strengthen, said he, the arms of activity, never turn back after victory, destroy everything to the end, spare the females, but as to everything else, such as murdering, plundering, burning, be sure to do all this because this is a holy war. And so the reason I mention those is that kind of attitude was definitely, I would say, inflamed, antagonized by the French, who had a lot to gain from the creation of Lebanon, kind of like how America had something to gain for the creation of that certain state in the Middle East, which we won't mention. But with Lebanon, there may have been good intentions amongst some French politicians, but essentially they wanted to carve up more of the Levant. Now, obviously, as a Christian of Lebanese ancestry, I think it would be a good idea to have a Christian state in that region of the world. But that's not what happened. The Lebanon that was created after the small zone that was majority Christian had to be expanded because after a famine in World War I, after the Ottomans collapsed or during their collapse, a large portion of people had suffered due to that famine. So they said, all right, we need a bigger land. We need some farmland. It can't just be like this little mountain stretch where there's Christians. So they debated over whether to take an area to the north called Wadi al-Nasara, which is literally Valley of the Christians. There's a lot of Orthodox Christians from Syria who live there today, and that was one of the favored locations. But the Maronite patriarch at the time said, we don't want that land because the Orthodox will outnumber us. So they ended up taking a lot of land that was majority Shia Muslim and some Sunni Muslims as well. So overnight, Lebanon went from being this tiny, city-state into being a half Christian, half Muslim kind of conglomerate, and that eventually led to many civil wars. But there was a lot of French influence in how Lebanon was created. And should they have just taken the Northern Territory, it might have been a much more stable country. But essentially most of Lebanon's history has been instability due to just how competitive all the sects have been there. And the Jesuit intrigue in particular comes about most famously in the late 1800s. And even people to this day who are still alive. There's a Christian leader named Samir Jaja, and he talks about how when he was imprisoned by the Syrians, he was reading Pierre Teilhard de Chardin and other works like that in order to be influenced on his worldview.
Interesting. So would you say that they only had that kind of influence with this the leader that you're talking about, or was there a push for a resurgence of Unionism or Maronite Catholicism there, or how widespread is that?
Yeah, so the Maronites definitely, I mean, this is mainly their leadership. Obviously, the average Maronite had no idea what was going on and had no say in this stuff, but much of the leadership, who had been, many of them educated in the West or educated in Jesuit funded universities, wanted Lebanon, even if it was half Muslim, to be, even if it wasn't majority Maronite, a Maronite led country. So they were comfortable being a large minority if it meant that they had the prime say over the government and where the country would go. That's one of the reasons they did not want so many Orthodox in their new country, because the Orthodox, being the premier Christian sect, would have booted them away from having as much authority. And again, this is just the leadership, but that's where the influence comes from. And so it's kind of interesting to see that, which would, backfire in having such a complex country with people that honestly didn't really want to be paired together, ended up having to do that. The Melkites, which again, for the audience, those are the Greek Catholics, for the most part, would kind of bounce between siding with the Orthodox, who obviously their liturgy is very similar to, and then sometimes siding with the Maronites. So they were kind of a mixed bag. But a lot of the Orthodox who ended up in what is Lebanon felt they had been kind of segregated from their Orthodox brethren in Jordan and the Holy Land in Syria.
Now, is Lebanon today majority Maronite or Muslim?
Well, the Maronites in what became the official state of Lebanon were never the majority. Christians were a majority slimly, like 52% maybe, but that's all the denominations combined. At that time, Maronites themselves were maybe 30% of the country. Right now, Maronites are maybe 20%. So once they made Lebanon, they were not the majority. The Orthodox are like 8% today, I think.
And what, Muslim are the majority now?
The Sunnis and Shia are split evenly at like almost 30% each.
Interesting. Yeah. Now, for those that are interested, you've done a lot of videos on a lot of topics. They go into a lot more depth. We kind of hit the high points today with Judaism, Islam, Christianity, a little bit of Catholicism. Any on that last point of maybe Lebanese stuff? Have you looked into any of the major events that have happened in Lebanon? For example, the embassy event, as to who might have been involved in that, what kind of machinations might have been there. If not, you don't have to go into that because it might be a little testy for YouTube.
Yeah, I mean, I'll be vague about it. I'm not that familiar with that event, though I do know many of the people implied, which everybody knows about that certain group, the yellow group that operates in Lebanon today. They have a really interesting history as well, because they came up in the early 80s and their job was to get the Zionists out of Lebanon. But they ended up now having way too much influence in the country. But the country that made them, Iran, of course, also has an interesting history. And this is why, guys, when you learn history, as I'm sure Jay could also agree with this, you got to learn everything. You can't just, things don't just happen in one little microcosm. They're implicated in many wider events. So, I mean, what's interesting about the Iranian Revolution, a lot of people like to point out that when Khomeini arrived in Iran, he had arrived from France. So there's a lot of Masonic allegation there, and that leads into what Lebanon is today. It's all very
I think French and British intelligence helped him, is the story.
Yeah, so he has a very strange background. It's very suspect, and a lot of the people who fought to allow him to come to power were not necessarily these like pious Muslims. Many of them were communists. Some of them were Masonics. I mean, it's a very complicated story, but the point is, if you want to understand Lebanon, you have to know about Iran, you have to know about the Arabian Peninsula, you have to understand all of that stuff.
Now, a little bit on that, because that's also an element I'm not really familiar with. I didn't realize that there was that much of a Shia presence there. What's the relationship with Iran and Lebanon?
Yeah.
And let me ask you that. The reason I say that is because we often hear in the Western media that Iran is aiding and training, militia in Lebanon and this kind of. So that's repeated in the Western media. Do you think that's accurate? And is that because of tensions with Israel and so forth? Is that basically what's going on?
Yeah, I mean, that group, they were essentially founded by Iran. There were two Shia groups that came about during the Civil War. One was more kind of nationalistic, they were allied with Syria. The other, which is what that militia is allied with Iran. And they've gone from being just like, hey, we're going to protect the South, we're going to protect the Shiite areas, to now having a really, really potent influence in the government, even taking out certain people of different sects that they may not like. So Lebanon's a little feudal. I mean, the Shia kind of rule their area, the Christians rule their area, but there is a wider influence in the country. And a lot of the influence that the Christians, particularly the Maronites, once had, has been diluted in favor of the Shia. And with the Sunnis, a lot of people mistakenly think they're just sitting around getting those meat bucks from Saudi Arabia, but actually they're not. They don't have much influence either. The Shia are definitely the prime guys in Lebanon at the moment.
And is it accurate that Iran arms and helps militia there?
Yeah, they definitely do. Sometimes they'll have minor disagreements, but I think that could just be staged stuff to show that they're not totally under their influence, but they are. They had the same objectives in Syria. That group went into Syria during the recent civil war there, and they were physically involved. So they have the same objectives pretty much everywhere, and they have branches in Iraq too.
So wait, you're saying that that they were interested in getting rid of Assad?
No, they fought. Iran and that militia fought on the side of Assad.
Okay, that's what I thought you meant. Okay, I was confused. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, they would be supporting Assad, I would think. So guys in the chat, remember you can subscribe to Jeem over in his channel. He's linked in the show description. Really great overview today. We kept it to about an hour, which is good. A lot of people are going to watch this, and we hit the high points. Anything else you want to leave us with that you think maybe we didn't dig into or we passed over too quick?
No, I think we got into a lot of good topics. I just suggest people to really read into where ideas come from in theology. Like, people don't just invent stuff out of thin air. So like what Maimonides says, which we discussed earlier, he's getting that from earlier stuff. Like, he doesn't invent this stuff. So you have to know, where do the Muslims get their idea of monotheism from? Where do the rabbinics? So you have
and
to
it comes from a
this.
lot of philosophy. It's not just from religious texts.
Definitely.
All right, well, awesome. Thank you, Jeem. I appreciate it. Guys, be sure and get tickets to our event June 22nd in Las Vegas. Unfortunately, Jamie Kennedy had to cancel, but we're still going forward with the event. It's still going to be fun. Jim Bob's there, Isaac's there, I'm there, Jamie's there, Jamie, my wife. It's going to be a lot of fun. It's going to be 6 hours of information and lectures and talks. It's going to be action-packed. It's going to be a blast. It's going to be epic. Get your tickets in the show description for the Eventbrite link, June 22nd. You can get my books as well over at Jason Analysis. And be sure to subscribe to Jeem. And everybody have a good evening.